The forest was silent, except for the crack of ice splitting on the trees. January 1945, the Ardennes. A lone American sniper crouched in a foxhole, watching a frozen corpse 20 yards ahead. A body that would soon become the deadliest bait of the winter campaign. What the Germans didn't know was that Corporal James Harker had spent the last 3 hours rigging that corpse with enough explosives to turn their entire advance into a killing zone. This is the story of how one man, armed with nothing but patience, a Springfield rifle, and a gamble that defied every rule of engagement, held off an entire German battalion for 72 hours, and lived to tell about it. Before we continue the story of Corporal Harker's impossible stand, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city, which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to discover what happened in those frozen Belgian woods. The snow fell heavy on the 3rd day of January. Corporal James Harker pressed himself deeper into the foxhole he'd carved from frozen earth and pine roots, his breath clouding in front of his face before dissipating into the gray morning. The Ardennes Forest stretched endlessly around him, a maze of skeletal trees and white silence, broken only by distant artillery rumbling like thunder beyond the ridgeline. His Springfield M1903A4 rested across his knees, the scope wrapped in a scrap of parachute silk to keep the lens from fogging. Harker was 23 years old, a farm boy from Nebraska who'd grown up shooting coyotes off fence posts at 200 yards. The Army had recognized his talent immediately at Fort Benning and assigned him to the 2nd Infantry Division as a designated marksman. That was 2 years ago. Now he was alone, separated from his unit during the chaos of the German counteroffensive, watching a section of forest trail that intelligence said the Wehrmacht used to move supplies between strong points. The cold was extraordinary. It pressed through his wool layers and into his bones, making every movement slow and deliberate. Harker flexed his fingers inside his mittens, keeping circulation alive. Frostbite had claimed more men than bullets in these woods. He'd seen soldiers lose toes, fingers, entire feet to the merciless cold. The thermometer clipped to his pack read -12 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd stopped feeling his face an hour ago. The corpse lay word had fallen 3 days prior. Private Eddie Morrison, Baker Company, killed by a German sniper during a patrol. The body had frozen solid in the position it died, on its back, one arm flung out, face turned toward the sky. Morrison had been 19, a kid from Pittsburgh who talked endlessly about his girlfriend and the garage he was going to open after the war. Harker had shared a foxhole with him in November. They'd played cards and smoked Lucky Strikes and complained about the cold. Now Morrison was just another casualty marker, another piece of the landscape. But as Harker studied the corpse through his scope, an idea began forming. A terrible, practical idea that made his stomach turn even as his tactical mind recognized its potential. The Germans had been using this trail with increasing frequency. Harker had counted 23 separate patrols in the last 48 hours. They were getting bold, arrogant even, moving in groups of 8 to 10 men with minimal caution. The frozen American bodies scattered throughout the forest had become scenery to them, markers of their advance. They barely glanced at the dead anymore. That indifference could be weaponized. Harker lowered his rifle and pulled out the crumpled tactical map from his coat. His unit, what remained of it, had retreated northwest toward Malmedy after the initial German assault. He was supposed to have pulled back with them, but a mortar barrage had separated him from his squad. By the time the shelling stopped, the Germans had pushed through, cutting off his route. For 3 days he'd been alone, surviving on K rations and melted snow, taking shots when opportunity presented itself. 12 confirmed kills. 12 Germans who'd never make it home. But it wasn't enough. Radio intercepts, fragments he'd caught on his SCR-300 before the battery died, suggested a full battalion was operating in this sector, maybe 600 men. One sniper couldn't stop that kind of force. But one sniper could slow them down, could make them afraid, could turn their own momentum against them. The sky lightened incrementally, the sun hidden behind layers of cloud that promised more snow. Harker waited until he was certain no patrols were approaching, then climbed carefully out of his foxhole. His joints protested, stiff from hours of immobility. He moved in a crouch toward Morrison's body, keeping his rifle ready, eyes scanning the tree line. Every exposed second was a calculated risk. German snipers were operating out here too, and they were good. Better than good. They'd been fighting since 1939, had survived Russia and North Africa. Harker was new by comparison, barely 2 years in combat. He reached the corpse and knelt beside it. Morrison's face was gray-white, eyes half open and clouded with ice. Harker whispered an apology his father had taught him, a prayer for the dead his family used back on the farm. Then he got to work. The frozen body was rigid, difficult to manipulate. Harker worked quickly, methodically, his bare hands already going numb despite the urgency of movement. From his pack he pulled 4 Mark II fragmentation grenades, standard-issue pineapples with their distinctive ribbed casings. He'd been carrying them since the retreat, saving them for an opportunity that mattered. This was that opportunity. He wedged 2 grenades under Morrison's back, positioning them carefully so they'd be triggered by any attempt to move or roll the body. The third he placed beneath the bent's knee, hidden from casual view. The fourth he held, considering. Morrison's coat was unbuttoned, revealing the wool shirt beneath. Harker forced the coat further open with his knife, creating a space near the chest. He nestled the grenade there, pulling the pin but keeping the spoon compressed with a length of tripwire that he ran through Morrison's frozen fingers and out to a nearby tree root. Anyone who tried to search the body for documents or identification would pull that wire. The whole process took 11 minutes. Harker's hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline by the time he finished. He stepped back, evaluating his work from multiple angles. The grenades were invisible unless you knew where to look. The body appeared undisturbed, just another frozen casualty in a forest full of them. He returned to his foxhole and settled back into position, pulling the camouflage netting over himself and his rifle. Then he waited. Waiting was the hardest part of a sniper's job, harder than the shot itself, harder than the fear. It required a specific kind of patience, the ability to remain absolutely still while your mind worked through every contingency, every angle, every possibility of what might go wrong. The patrol came just after noon. Harker heard them before he saw them, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the metallic clink of equipment, low voices speaking German. 8 soldiers moving in a loose formation along the trail. They wore the white winter camouflage smocks of the Wehrmacht, Kar 98K rifles slung over their shoulders, coal scuttle helmets dusted with snow. An Obergefreiter led them, an older soldier with 3 days of stubble and hard eyes that had seen too much. Harker's finger found the trigger. He'd positioned himself with a clear field of fire, the trail crossing his sight line at a 90-degree angle. The range was 48 yards, an easy shot, but he held his fire. One shot would alert them, give away his position. The trap was more valuable than a single kill. The Germans passed Morrison's body without stopping. One soldier glanced at the corpse, but kept walking, his attention focused ahead. Harker exhaled slowly, disappointment mixing with relief. The bait hadn't worked. But that was war. Most plans failed. Most opportunities passed unused. You adapted and tried again. 2 hours later, another patrol. This one was larger, 12 men, moving faster. A different attitude entirely. These soldiers were combat veterans, their movements economical and professional. They were sweeping the forest systematically, checking positions, looking for threats. An Unteroffizier commanded them, his commands crisp and efficient. They saw Morrison immediately. The Unteroffizier raised a fist, halting the column. He pointed at the body and barked something Harker couldn't hear. 2 soldiers moved forward cautiously, rifles raised. They approached Morrison from opposite angles, covering each other, professional and careful. This wasn't going to work. These men were too smart, too experienced. They'd spocked the trap before they triggered it. But then the younger of the 2 soldiers, a kid who couldn't have been more than 18, relaxed slightly. He lowered his rifle and stepped directly beside the corpse. Said something to his companion, probably a joke about dead Americans, judging by the brief laugh that followed. The older soldier shook his head, but moved closer as well, kneeling down to check Morrison's coat for documents. Harker held his breath. Through his scope, he could see the soldier's hands moving toward Morrison's chest, toward the unbuttoned coat. The tripwire was invisible against the snow, running through frozen fingers to the tree root 5 feet away. The soldier's hand found Morrison's collar, pulled. The grenade detonated with a thunderous crack that echoed through the forest, sending up a fountain of frozen dirt, snow, and steel fragments. The soldier checking the body disappeared in the blast. His companion was thrown backwards, landing in a heap 3 yards away. The concussive force triggered the second grenade, the one under Morrison's back, which detonated half a second later. Then the third, beneath the knee. A cascading chain of explosions that turned that section of trail into a killing zone. The surviving Germans scattered, diving for cover behind trees and into shallow depressions. They were shouting, confused, trying to locate the source of the attack. The Unteroffizier was screaming orders, organizing a defensive perimeter, but they didn't know where to aim. There'd been no muzzle flash, no gunshot, just sudden, devastating violence from an impossible source. Harker still didn't fire. He remained frozen in position, watching through his scope as the Germans regrouped. 4 men down, 2 dead from the grenades, 2 wounded and screaming. The Unteroffizier was pointing, organizing his men to search the tree line. They thought they were being ambushed by a concealed squad, maybe a whole platoon. It would never occur to them that one man had done this, that the dead American had been rigged as bait. The patrol withdrew 20 minutes later, dragging their wounded and leaving their dead. Harker counted them as they retreated. 8 men moving back the way they'd come, considerably faster now, considerably more alert. They'd report this. Within hours, every German unit in the sector would know that the forest was booby-trapped, that even the corpses weren't safe, and that fear would spread, would slow their advance, would make them cautious and paranoid, would buy time for the American forces regrouping to the northwest. One man couldn't stop a battalion, But one man could haunt them, could become the ghost in these woods that they'd waste time and resources trying to hunt.
Harker allowed himself a small smile as the Germans disappeared from view. He chambered around in his Springfield, settled deeper into his foxhole, and began planning his next move. The game had begun. And out here in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, with nothing but ingenuity and determination, he intended to make every German soldier who entered these woods wish they'd stayed home. The temperature dropped as afternoon faded toward evening, and Harker knew he needed to relocate before darkness fell completely. The golden rule of sniper warfare was simple: shoot and move. Never stay in the same position after engaging the enemy. The Germans would be looking for him now, organizing search parties, bringing up more experienced troops, maybe even their own snipers. He couldn't afford to be where they expected him to be. He packed his equipment methodically, every movement deliberate despite his numb fingers. The Springfield went across his back, secured with a canvas sling. His pack held 3 days of K-rations, medical supplies, extra ammunition, and 6 more grenades. He'd started the campaign with 12. 48 rounds of .30-06 ammunition remained in his pouches. Against a battalion, it might as well have been 48 grains of sand against the tide. But each round represented a German soldier who wouldn't fire back, wouldn't advance, wouldn't threaten the American lines. Harker moved northeast, parallel to the German supply route, but deeper into the forest. He knew this terrain now, had memorized every depression and ridgeline during his 3 days of observation. 200 yards from his previous position, he found what he was looking for: a small ravine carved by spring runoff, now frozen and drifted with snow. The far side was steep, providing natural cover and elevation. He could overlook the trail from here while remaining invisible from below. He carved a new hide into the snowbank on the ravine's edge, packing the excavated snow into a low wall that would break up his silhouette. Then he settled in, wrapped his scope, and resumed his vigil. The light was failing fast now, that strange twilight glow that snow amplifies. Visibility would be limited for the next few hours, but Harker wasn't concerned. The Germans wouldn't move at night if they could avoid it. Too dangerous, too easy to blunder into an ambush or get lost. They'd wait for morning, come back with more men and heavier weapons. Maybe even bring up a tank if one was available, though the narrow forest trails made armor nearly useless out here. As darkness settled completely, Harker allowed himself a moment to think about home. The farm in Nebraska seemed impossibly distant, almost fictional. His father would be feeding cattle right now, breaking ice on the water troughs, his breath smoking in the cold prairie wind. His mother would be in the kitchen, preparing supper, listening to the radio for news from Europe. Did they know where he was? Did the Army tell families when soldiers went missing during combat? He'd written them a letter 3 weeks ago, before the German offensive began. But mail moved slowly through combat zones. They probably hadn't received it yet. He pushed the thoughts away. Homesickness was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not here, not now. Out here, you stayed sharp or you died. It was that simple, that absolute. The cold, the fear, the loneliness, these were just conditions, no different than drought or blizzard back home. You endured them, you adapted, you survived. Harker ate a D-ration chocolate bar, chewing slowly to make it last, then settled in for the long night. Sleep was impossible. The cold wouldn't allow it, and the risk was too great. Instead, he entered that half-aware state that soldiers learn, where your body rests, but your mind remains alert for danger. His ears tracked every sound, the occasional crack of freezing wood, the distant rumble of artillery.
The almost inaudible whisper of snow sliding off pine branches. Nothing human, nothing close. The night stretched endlessly, each hour measured by the slow rotation of stars visible through gaps in the clouds. Harker's thoughts drifted to Morrison, to the use he'd made of his friend's body. It bothered him, even though tactically it had been the right decision. Using the dead as weapons felt wrong somehow, disrespectful. But war stripped away the luxury of sentiment. Out here, everything was ammunition. Trees for cover, snow for concealment, corpses for bait. The Germans certainly didn't hesitate to use whatever advantages they could find. Why should he? Because you're American, a voice in his head whispered, his father's voice. Because we're supposed to be better than them. We're fighting for something that matters. Harker turned that thought over in his mind, examining it from different angles. Were they better, or just better equipped, better fed, better supplied? The Germans in these woods were just soldiers like him, following orders, trying to survive. Most of them probably hated the war as much as he did. But they'd chosen their side, or their country had chosen for them, and now men died because of those choices. There was no moral complexity in that simple fact, no ambiguity. You fought for your side, or you died, and the other guy died, and eventually one side ran out of men, or will, or both. Democracy versus tyranny, freedom versus fascism. Those words felt abstract out here, intellectual concepts that meant nothing when you were cold and scared and alone. But Harker held on to them anyway, because they were all he had. His grandfather had fought the Spanish in Cuba. His father had registered for the Great War, but never shipped out. Now it was his turn. The Harker men served when called. It was that simple. Dawn arrived slowly, painfully, the darkness retreating by degrees until the forest became visible again in shades of gray and white. Harker's entire body ached from the cold and immobility. He forced himself to move, flexing muscles, restoring circulation. A soldier who couldn't move quickly was a dead soldier. He ate another K-ration, canned hash that had frozen solid overnight, and melted snow in his canteen cup for water. The liquid was metallic and cold, but necessary. Dehydration killed as surely as bullets out here. The Germans came back at 0800 hours. Harker heard them long before they appeared, voices calling back and forth. Orders being shouted, the distinctive rumble of vehicles somewhere beyond the tree line. They were bringing up reinforcements, treating this section of forest like a major threat. Good. That meant they were afraid. Fear made soldiers slow, made them second-guess, made them vulnerable. Through his scope, Harker watched the new force assemble on the trail. 40 men at least, maybe 50. A full company. They wore combat webbing and carried Panzerfausts, submachine guns, heavy machine guns broken down for transport. This was a serious sweep, organized and methodical. And Hauptmann commanded them, a captain with decorations on his chest and the confident bearing of someone who'd survived multiple campaigns. Behind the infantry came a small artillery piece, a Lig-18, a light infantry gun that could lob 75mm shells. They were bringing that gun up to destroy whatever strong point they thought had ambushed their patrol yesterday. Harker felt his pulse quicken. This was beyond his capabilities now. He couldn't fight 50 men and artillery. The smart move was to withdraw, disappear deeper into the forest, survive to fight another day. But if he withdrew, the Germans would advance unopposed, would push closer to Malmedy, closer to the American positions. Every hour he delayed them was another hour for the defenders to dig in, for reinforcements to arrive.
for artillery to register targets. He made his decision quickly, without overthinking. Sometimes action was better than analysis. Sometimes you just had to trust your training and your instincts, and the farm boy stubbornness that had gotten him through 23 years of hardship and war.
The German captain was organizing his men into 3 groups, sweeps that would move through the forest in a coordinated pattern, flushing out any concealed enemy. Smart tactics, professional execution. These weren't green recruits. These were veterans who knew their business. Harker targeted the captain first. Not the killing shot, not yet, but the shot that would disrupt command, create chaos, buy precious seconds of confusion. He settled his crosshairs on the officer's right shoulder, compensating for wind and distance, breathing slow and steady. The range was 82 yards, an easy shot for his Springfield. He could make this shot in his sleep. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the captain spin and fall, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across the white camouflage. The other Germans dropped immediately, seeking cover, shouting, scanning for the shooter. But Harker was already working the bolt, chambering a new round, finding his next target. A sergeant was trying to reach the fallen captain. Harker put a round through the sergeant's leg, dropping him. Not killing shots. Wounded men required care, required other soldiers to stop fighting and render aid, required evacuation and medical resources. A dead soldier was just dead. A wounded soldier was a burden the enemy had to carry. The Germans opened fire, spraying bullets in every direction, hammering the tree line with automatic weapons fire. But they were shooting blind, panicked. Harker had chosen his position carefully. The ravine gave him cover, and his muzzle blast was partially concealed by the geography. They knew roughly where he was, but couldn't pinpoint his exact location. The Lig artillery piece was his primary concern. If they brought that gun to bear on his position, no amount of cover would save him. He shifted his aim, finding the gun crew. 4 men were struggling to unlimber the piece, to bring it into action. Harker shot the Geschützführer, the gun commander, through the chest. A killing shot this time, deliberate and necessary. The commander collapsed across the gun's trail, and the rest of the crew scattered. German infantry were advancing now, moving through the trees in fire and maneuver teams. Professional tactics, properly executed. They were closing the distance, laying down suppressing fire. Within minutes, they'd have his position flanked. Time to move. Harker fired his last shot from this position. Another wounding hit on a soldier trying to work the abandoned artillery piece, then rolled backward down the ravine's far slope. He came up running, staying low, using the terrain for cover. Bullets whipped through the branches above him, thunking into tree trunks, kicking up sprays of snow. Close. Too close. He ran 200 yards before dropping into another depression, a shell crater from an earlier bombardment. His lungs burned from the cold air and exertion. Behind him, he could hear the Germans organizing, their officers shouting, their units reforming. They'd be coming soon, converging on his last position, searching methodically. Harker checked his ammunition. 36 rounds remaining. Not enough for a sustained fight. He needed to hit and move, staying ahead of their search pattern while inflicting maximum disruption. Classic guerrilla tactics, the kind of warfare that regular armies hated because it negated their advantages in numbers and firepower. The forest was his ally now. These Germans were operating in unfamiliar terrain, slowed by the snow and cold, vulnerable to ambush. Harker knew every ridge and draw within a 2-mile radius. He could use that knowledge, could become the nightmare that haunted their advance. He moved again,
circling wide to the east, putting distance between himself and the search parties. As he moved, he counted his assets. 6 grenades, 36 rounds, 3 days of food, 1 exhausted sniper with frostbitten fingers and determination that refused to quit.
Against 50 Germans, it should have been hopeless, but Harker had been outnumbered his entire life. Outnumbered by coyotes on the farm, outnumbered by bigger kids in school, outnumbered by circumstances and fate. Being outnumbered just meant you had to be smarter, faster, more willing to take risks. The Ardennes Forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a frozen maze of tactical possibility. Somewhere in that maze, a German battalion was hunting him, and somewhere in that maze, Corporal James Harker was planning his next move in a war that would be won not by the biggest army, but by the soldier who refused to quit.
The afternoon brought fresh snow, heavy flakes that reduced visibility to 50 yards and covered tracks within minutes. Harker used the weather to his advantage, moving boldly now, confident that his trail would disappear almost as quickly as he made it. He worked his way south, paralleling the German search pattern, but staying ahead of it, listening to their shouted commands fade behind him. By 1500 hours, he'd circled completely around their position and returned to the original trail where Morrison's body had been. The Germans had cleared the area, removed their dead, posted guards. 3 soldiers stood watch at 50-yard intervals, alert and nervous, rifles ready. They were jumpy, spinning at every sound, every movement in the forest. The ambush yesterday had accomplished its purpose. These men were afraid now, seeing threats in every shadow. Harker studied them through his scope, from 300 yards away, well beyond effective rifle range. He was looking for patterns, routines, any exploitable weakness in their security. The guards rotated every hour, replaced by fresh men from the main force. During the changeover, there was a brief window, maybe 30 seconds, when attention lapsed, when old guards focused on getting warm and new guards focused on getting oriented. That window was all he needed. He watched 3 rotations, timing them precisely. At 16:52 hours, the guards changed again. Harker moved during that 30-second gap, sprinting across open ground to reach a position closer to the trail. He dropped behind a fallen log, breathing hard, and immediately began scanning for reaction. None. The new guards hadn't seen him. They were still settling in, still adjusting to the cold and the isolation. From this position, Harker could see the main German encampment 200 yards further east. They'd established a temporary command post in a cluster of farm buildings that had been abandoned weeks ago. Smoke rose from chimneys. They'd risked fires for warmth, calculating that concealment was less important than keeping soldiers combat effective. Smart decision. Frostbite casualties could cripple a unit faster than combat losses. Harker counted roughly 60 soldiers visible around the buildings, but there would be more inside, sheltering from the cold. Call it 80 men total. A full company, well-armed and organized. They had sentries posted, patrols circulating, proper military discipline. Assaulting that position would be suicide. But Harker wasn't planning an assault. He was planning something more subtle, more psychological. He was planning to prove that nowhere in this forest was safe, that even their command post could be touched. He waited until full darkness, until the guards were bored and cold, and focused mainly on surviving their shift. Then he moved again, crawling now, using every inch of cover. The snow helped, muffling sound, hiding movement. He covered the 200 yards in 40 minutes of painstaking infiltration. moving only when sentries looked away, freezing absolutely still when their attention swung back. The farm buildings formed a rough square around a central courtyard. Germans were visible through windows, shadows moving against lamplight. Harker could hear them talking, laughing, the sounds of men trying to maintain morale in brutal conditions. A radio crackled somewhere inside, broadcasting messages from higher command. He caught fragments of German, something about supply problems, requests for ammunition and medical supplies. Good. They were stretched thin, overextended. That meant pressure elsewhere on the line, other American units fighting back, contesting every mile of the German advance. Harker wasn't alone after all. He was just one piece of a larger battle, one soldier among thousands trying to hold the line. He circled the buildings until he found what he was looking for. A window left partially open for ventilation, situated on the building's blind side, where sentries couldn't easily observe. Someone had been careless, prioritizing comfort over security. That carelessness would cost them. Harker pulled 2 grenades from his pack. He armed them both, pulling the pins but holding the spoons. This required perfect timing. If he fumbled, if his frozen fingers failed, he'd die in the explosion. But hesitation would kill him just as surely. Out here, boldness was the only option. He rose to a crouch, stepped to the window, and tossed both grenades inside in quick succession. Then he ran, sprinting for the tree line, pumping his legs, forcing his body past exhaustion. Behind him, he heard shouts of alarm, German voices screaming warnings. Then the first grenade detonated, a muffled crump that rattled windows and sent shrapnel through wood walls. The second followed immediately after, the dual blasts overlapping into a continuous roar. Harker didn't look back. He crashed through underbrush, vaulted a fallen tree, slid down a slope into the darkness of the forest. Gunfire erupted behind him, wild and undisciplined, Germans shooting at shadows and fear. Bullets snapped through branches overhead, but Harker was already gone, swallowed by the night. He ran for 20 minutes before stopping, lungs burning, legs shaking from adrenaline. Behind him, orange flames lit the sky. He'd started a fire in one of the buildings. Smoke rose in thick columns, visible even through the snow. The Germans would be organizing fire parties now, evacuating wounded, trying to restore order. They'd lost men. He didn't know how many, probably not more than 5 or 6, but the psychological impact would far exceed the physical casualties. Nowhere was safe. Not even their headquarters, not even with sentries posted. One American sniper had penetrated their security, struck at will, and disappeared like a ghost. Harker allowed himself a grim smile as he moved deeper into the forest, putting distance between himself and the chaos he'd created. The game was intensifying. The Germans would respond with overwhelming force now, commit more resources to hunting him. But every soldier searching for him was a soldier not advancing, not attacking American positions, not pushing toward Malmedy or Liège or Antwerp. One man couldn't stop a battalion, but one man could buy time, could make them bleed for every yard, could prove that American soldiers didn't quit, didn't surrender, didn't break, even when outnumbered and outgunned, and operating alone behind enemy lines. The temperature dropped below 0 that night, and Harker's situation became desperate. He'd been operating for 4 days now, with minimal food and no real shelter. Exhaustion was setting in, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that killed judgment, that made soldiers careless. His hands shook constantly from cold and adrenaline. His feet were numb inside his boots, potential frostbite, though he didn't dare remove his boots to check. Removing them might mean not getting them back on. He found a hollow beneath a windfall tree and crawled inside, pulling branches and snow over the opening to create a minimal shelter. It wasn't much, but it blocked the wind and trapped a little body heat. He ate his last K-ration, chewing mechanically, barely tasting the food. His water was frozen solid in his canteen, despite keeping it inside his coat. He'd have to melt snow again in the morning. Sleep came in fragments, his body shutting down despite the danger. He dreamed of home, of summer heat and cornfields, and his father's steady voice. Woke shivering and disoriented, uncertain whether minutes or hours had passed. The darkness was absolute, pressing in from all sides. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was, why he was so cold. Then memory returned. The war, the forest, the Germans hunting him. He forced himself to stay awake after that, reciting baseball statistics in his head to keep his mind active. The 1944 World Series, Cardinals versus Browns, a St. Louis championship. Strange to think that baseball had continued during the war, that people back home lived normal lives, while men fought and died in places they'd never heard of. Dawn found him still alive, still functional, though barely. His body had entered a state of numb acceptance, pain dulled to distant sensation. He ate snow for water and emerged from his shelter into a world transformed by fresh snowfall. Everything looked different now. Landmarks obscured, his mental map disrupted. He needed to relocate, needed to find a better position. But more than that, he needed to confirm that his actions had achieved their purpose. Had the Germans slowed their advance? Were they still hunting him? Or had they decided he wasn't worth the resources? Harker moved northwest toward where American lines had been 4 days ago. The forest was eerily quiet. No sounds of combat, no artillery rumbling. That could mean anything. A lull in fighting, a German breakthrough, American positions overrun. He had no way to know. His radio was dead, his units scattered or captured or killed. He was operating blind, making decisions based on instinct and hope. 3 hours of careful movement brought him to a ridgeline overlooking a valley. Below, he saw what he'd been searching for. A German supply column stretched along a narrow road, trucks and half-tracks and horse-drawn wagons, bringing ammunition and food to the forward units. They were moving slowly, carefully, their escorts scanning the forest with obvious paranoia. Harker counted vehicles, 12 trucks, 4 half-tracks, 30 escort soldiers. A tempting target, but beyond his capability to disrupt significantly. A single sniper couldn't stop a supply column, but he could report it, could call down artillery if he could somehow re-establish contact with American forces. That became his new objective: make contact, relay intelligence, get extracted. He'd done his part, bought time, proved that one determined soldier could make a difference. Now, he needed to survive long enough to share what he'd learned. He paralleled the supply column for an hour, memorizing details, counting vehicles, noting weapons and unit markings. This was valuable intelligence, the kind that staff officers needed for planning counterattacks. The Germans were supplying their forward units through this route, which meant it was important, vulnerable. A few well-placed artillery strikes could create chaos, strand entire companies without ammunition or food. The sound of American voices froze him mid-step. Harker dropped prone immediately, rifle raised, searching for targets. Had he stumbled into a German position? Were they using captured Americans as bait? Then he saw the uniforms. American. 3 soldiers moving through the forest ahead, wearing the patches of the 1st Infantry Division. They were patrolling carefully, professionally, weapons ready. Real Americans. His own side.
Harker nearly called out immediately, relief washing through him, but training held him back. He needed to be certain. Germans had impersonated Americans before, wearing captured uniforms, using American tactics. He studied the soldiers through his scope, looking for details. Their movements were right. Their weapons were right. The way they communicated with hand signals, that was American doctrine. He took a calculated risk. "Powhatan!" he called out, using the day's password that he'd memorized a week ago. It might be outdated, but it was all he had. The 3 soldiers spun toward his voice, rifles raised. A tense moment of silence. Then, "Resolved!" the countersign, correctly given. Harker stood slowly, hands visible, rifle pointed skyward. "Corporal James Harker, 2nd Infantry Division. I've been operating behind German lines for 4 days. I have intelligence." The patrol leader, a staff sergeant with a weathered face, approached cautiously, his men covering. "You're the sniper," he said, not a question. "The one who's been raising hell in Sector 7. "Yes, Sergeant. We've been hearing rumors. Germans are reporting a ghost in the forest. Said one man has been picking them apart, hitting their command post, mining trails with bodies. We thought it was exaggeration. It's not." The sergeant looked Harker up and down, taking in his condition. The frostbite damage, the exhaustion, the blood on his uniform from a dozen small wounds. "You look like hell, Corporal." "I feel worse than I look." "I believe it." The sergeant keyed his radio. "Talon 6, this is Talon 2-3. We've recovered that missing sniper. Sector 7. Requires immediate extraction and debrief. Break. He says he has intelligence. Over." The radio crackled. "Talon 2-3, roger. Grid coordinates?" The sergeant read off their position, while Harker sank down against a tree, suddenly unable to stand any longer. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 4 days was draining away, leaving only exhaustion and pain. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His vision blurred at the edges. One of the other soldiers offered him a canteen. "Water, Corporal. Drink slow." Harker drank, the cold water painful going down. He forced himself to focus. "There's a supply column in the valley. 12 trucks, 4 half-tracks, 30 escorts. Grid coordinates roughly—" He recited the numbers from memory, his training overriding his body's collapse. The sergeant was writing it down. "What else?" "Battalion strength in Sector 7. Maybe 80 men, positioned around farm buildings at—" More coordinates. "They're stretched thin. Supply problems. Radio chatter suggests pressure elsewhere. If we push here, they'll break." "Good intel." The sergeant called it in, his voice crisp and professional. Within minutes, plans were being made at battalion level. Artillery would register the supply column. Infantry would probe the farm buildings. The information Harker had gathered, the time he'd bought, was about to pay dividends. 30 minutes later, a half-track arrived to evacuate them. Harker was loaded aboard along with the patrol, and they began the journey back to American lines. As they drove, Harker could hear artillery rumbling in the distance. American guns firing the coordinates he'd provided. Somewhere in that forest, German supply trucks were being obliterated. German soldiers were diving for cover. German plans were being disrupted. One man, 4 days, 48 rounds of ammunition, and 6 grenades. It shouldn't have mattered, but it had. The regimental aid station was crowded with wounded when Harker arrived, but a medic took one look at him and immediately began treating the frostbite. The diagnosis wasn't good. Possible amputation of 3 toes,
severe damage to both hands, early stages of hypothermia. But Harker was alive, functional, and carrying intelligence that could shift the tactical balance in this sector. A captain from S2 Intelligence debriefed him over the next 2 hours while medics worked on his injuries. Harker described everything: German positions, unit strengths, supply routes, patrol patterns. The intelligence officer took notes rapidly, asked pointed questions, cross-referenced Harker's observations with aerial reconnaissance.
"This is excellent work, Corporal," the captain said finally. "Your actions may have saved hundreds of lives. The German advance in this sector has stalled completely. They're committing excessive resources to security, slowing their logistics, second-guessing every movement. You've given us exactly what we needed: time and information." Harker wanted to feel proud, wanted to feel accomplished. Instead, he just felt tired, bone-tired, soul-tired. He'd survived, but Morrison and dozens of other Americans hadn't. Victory felt hollow when you counted the cost in friends and fellow soldiers.
"What happens now, sir?" he asked. "Now you rest, get warm, let the medics do their work. Then we'll see about getting you back to your unit." "My unit is being reconstituted," the captain said gently. "You lost a lot of men during the initial German assault, but you're not the only survivor. Your squad leader made it out. So did most of your platoon. They've been asking about you."
That brought a genuine smile to Harker's face. His squad had survived. They hadn't been overrun or captured or killed. Somehow, against all odds, most of them had made it.
"Get some rest, Corporal. You've earned it." Rest came easily now, his body shutting down the moment he felt safe. Harker slept for 18 hours straight, unconscious through the pain and cold, his mind finally allowing itself to let go. When he woke, he was in a heated tent with clean bandages on his hands and feet, an IV running fluids into his arm. Outside, he could hear the ordinary sounds of an army camp: engines running, soldiers talking, radios crackling with routine traffic.
The war continued. It always continued. But for this moment, in this place, Harker had done his part, had proven that American soldiers didn't break, didn't quit, didn't surrender, even when facing impossible odds. The tactics he'd pioneered in those frozen woods, using terrain and psychology as weapons, turning the enemy's momentum against them, would be studied and refined, incorporated into training manuals and tactical doctrine. But more than tactics, Harker had demonstrated something fundamental about the American soldier. Farm boys and city kids, immigrants and natives, educated and rough. When called upon, when tested by fire and cold and fear, they rose to meet the challenge. They adapted, they improvised, they overcame. That was the real lesson of those 4 days in the Ardennes. Not the specific techniques or methods, but the underlying truth they revealed. That American ingenuity, determination, and courage were weapons more powerful than any rifle or grenade. The frozen corpse trap that had started it all, Morrison's body turned into bait. That had been just the beginning. A desperate gambit by an isolated soldier that had escalated into a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Harker had taken the tools at hand: terrain, weather, fear, and American stubbornness, and forged them into an effective weapon against a larger, better-positioned enemy force. In the weeks that followed, as Harker recovered and the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its conclusion, intelligence officers studied his tactics. Training officers incorporated his methods into field manuals. Other snipers, inspired by his example, began employing similar psychological warfare techniques.
The frozen corpse trap itself became almost legendary, whispered about in foxholes and command posts, embellished with each retelling, until the real story was barely recognizable beneath the myth.
But Harker knew the truth, knew it wasn't heroism or genius, just necessity and adaptation. When you're alone and cold and scared, when the odds are impossible and retreat isn't an option, you use whatever you have. You improvise. You take risks. You refuse to quit. That was the American way. That was why, despite being outmanned and outgunned in those desperate winter days, American forces had held, had slowed the German offensive, had bought time for reinforcements to arrive, for logistics to catch up, for the Allied war machine to bring its full weight to bear. One sniper in a frozen forest couldn't win a war. But one sniper could change a battle, could buy precious hours and days, could prove that even when the situation seemed hopeless, victory was possible, if you were willing to fight for it.
3 weeks after his evacuation, Harker returned to duty. His toes had been saved, though he'd never again have full feeling in his feet. His hands were scarred, but functional. The nightmares would last longer. Dreams of Morrison's frozen face, of German soldiers screaming, of that terrible cold that had nearly killed him. But he was alive, and he was ready to continue the fight. The 2nd Infantry Division was preparing for the next phase of operations, pushing into Germany itself, taking the fight to the enemy's homeland. Harker reported to his squad, which welcomed him back with the rough affection that soldiers show for one of their own who'd survived the impossible. "Heard you went full Davy Crockett out there," his squad leader said. "One man against a whole German battalion." "It was never that dramatic, Sergeant. According to S2, you killed or wounded 27 Germans, destroyed a command post, disrupted supply lines, and tied up an entire company for 4 days. Sounds pretty dramatic to me." Harker shrugged. He'd done what needed doing, nothing more. "Well, whatever you want to call it, it got noticed. You're being put in for a Silver Star, maybe even a Distinguished Service Cross. Higher-ups are still deciding." "I don't need a medal, Sergeant." "Maybe not, but you're getting one anyway. What you did, it mattered, Harker. It gave us time, saved lives. That's worth recognizing." In March 1945, Corporal James Harker was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony attended by his entire company. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, Corporal Harker, when separated from his unit during enemy offensive operations, operated alone behind enemy lines for 4 days, inflicting significant casualties on enemy forces and providing critical intelligence that enabled American forces to disrupt enemy supply lines and slow the enemy advance. His actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army." The medal was pinned to his chest by a general whose name Harker promptly forgot. What he remembered instead were the faces of his squad watching from formation, the approval in their eyes, the unspoken message that he was one of them, had proven himself, had earned his place in the brotherhood of soldiers who'd seen combat and survived. The war ended 2 months later. Germany surrendered in May, and with it came the slow process of occupation, demobilization, and return to civilian life. Harker shipped home in August 1945 aboard a Liberty ship crowded with veterans, all trying to process what they'd experienced, what they'd survived. He returned to the farm in Nebraska, to parents who barely recognized the man their son had become.
The boy who'd left in 1943 had been replaced by someone harder, quieter, marked by experiences he could never fully explain. But he was home. And slowly, day by day, farm work and familiar routine began to heal the wounds that medicine couldn't reach. Harker never talked much about the war. When pressed, he'd acknowledge that he'd served in Europe, had seen combat, had done his duty. But the details, Morrison's frozen body, the desperate days alone in the forest, the fear and cold and killing, those stayed locked inside. Some things couldn't be shared. Some burdens had to be carried alone. In 1947, Harker married a school teacher from Grand Island. They had 3 children, worked the farm, lived the quiet life that millions of veterans were building across America. On the surface, James Harker was just another farmer, indistinguishable from his neighbors. But occasionally, usually on cold winter nights when snow fell heavy and the temperature dropped below zero, his wife would wake to find him standing at the window, staring out at the darkness, his hands flexing unconsciously as if working a rifle bolt. She learned not to ask, just stood beside him, a quiet presence, until whatever memories held him finally released their grip and he returned to bed. The decades passed. The greatest generation aged, their numbers dwindling as time did what enemy bullets couldn't. Harker watched friends die, attended funerals, listened to eulogies that rarely captured the full truth of what they'd experienced. The war that had defined their youth receded into history, studied by grandchildren who couldn't quite grasp what it had been like, how desperate and uncertain victory had seemed. But the lessons remained. The tactics Harker had pioneered in that frozen forest, psychological warfare, asymmetric operations, using limited resources against superior forces. Those were studied at West Point and Fort Benning. Military historians wrote papers analyzing his actions. Training manuals referenced the Frozen Corps incident as an example of battlefield innovation under extreme conditions. Harker himself remained modest about it all. When asked, he'd say he'd just done what needed doing, that any soldier in his situation would have acted the same, that he'd been lucky, nothing more. But his fellow veterans knew better. They understood that luck was only part of it, that what Harker had accomplished in those 4 days required more than chance, required courage, ingenuity, determination, and a refusal to quit even when every rational calculation said the situation was hopeless. That was the real legacy of Corporal James Harker's war. Not the specific tactics or methods, but the principle underlying them. That American soldiers, when tested, when pushed to their limits, found ways to win, found ways to adapt, to overcome, to achieve victory against impossible odds. The frozen corpse trap was just a symbol of that larger truth, a dramatic example of battlefield innovation that captured public imagination. But the reality was simpler and more profound. One soldier, armed with training and determination and unwillingness to surrender, had made a difference, had changed the course of a battle, had bought time for his fellow Americans to regroup and counterattack. And in the end, wasn't that what service was about? Not glory or medals or recognition, but doing your duty when called upon. Standing firm when it would be easier to quit. Fighting for something larger than yourself, for your brothers in arms, for the people back home, for the principles your nation claimed to represent. James Harker understood that, lived it, demonstrated it in a frozen Belgian forest when victory seemed impossible and defeat inevitable. And in doing so, he'd added his name to the long roll of ordinary Americans who'd done extraordinary things when their country needed them most. That was his real medal, his true decoration. Not the Bronze Star with its blue ribbon, but the knowledge that when tested by fire and cold and fear, he hadn't broken, hadn't quit, had proven worthy of the uniform he wore and the flag he fought for. The rest, the tactics, the kills, the legend of the frozen corpse trap, those were just details. Interesting historically, useful tactically, but ultimately secondary to the fundamental truth they illustrated. American soldiers don't quit, don't surrender, don't break. When faced with impossible odds, they find a way. Corporal James Harker had found his way, and in doing so, he'd lit a path for others to follow.